Welcome to this workshop. I'm Olaf Witkowski from Cross Labs and the University of Tokyo. And I'm really thrilled to welcome everyone today, together with Lana Sinapayen from Sony Computer Science Labs, together with whom we decided to gather people interested in this topic of novelty in science to reflect on whether the structure of science organizations makes innovation harder instead of easier, maybe. As researchers, research organizers, etc., other roles in academia or the industry, maybe you have experienced either a misalignment in your evaluation metrics with the best path for science, or that the way that the institution's mission is being implemented doesn't naturally lead to most creative practice of generative science, but instead may even slow down the pursuit of innovation in research. And today, I'm also joined by Samuel Arbesman from Lux Capital. We also discussed early on this topic, by Dana Kardia from Cardia Group, Rosanne Liu from ML Collective and Google Brain, Kelly Mack from the Association of American Colleges and Universities. I'm checking just not to forget anyone. Ben Reinhardt, of course, from Private ARPA. And I'll pass right now the mic to Lana.
Yeah, Thank you, Olaf. So what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce each speaker, and each speaker will give a short pitch about an issue that they think slows down innovation in science organizations. So I'm going to start with Rosanne Liu. She is the co-founder and executive director of Machine Learning Collective, which is a non-profit research organization to democratize machine learning research. And she's also a research scientist in Google Brain. You might have watched her viral honest video titled AI Research, the Unreasonably Narrow Path and How Not to Be Miserable. So Rosanne.
Thank you. So glad I'm going first, because I was worried that my answers will be someone else's answer, and if they said it first, then I would have no answers. Just to repeat, the question is, what's the one thing we want to change about the current science organization? And I feel like an organization, science or not, in a short way, it should provide, I think, a satisfaction that's not just one thing. It should provide a satisfaction for its members or employees that's not just from one source. So let me break it down to an organization that is employment-based or non-employment-based, that two paths, because I think that's the most prevalent forms that we have in science organizations. So employment-based organization, let's say researchers are their employees, really the satisfaction should not just come from money. So that's number one. And the other format that is non-employment based, let's say it's a university and you are a student of the university, so you're a member of that organization, and the satisfaction should not just be, in this example, a degree. Like once I got the degree, I'm satisfied. If I'm not getting the degree, I'm unsatisfied. That should not be the single source of satisfaction. I can elaborate more, but I think what I'm trying to say is we should get more than one thing from the organization, and in any way, the source should be diversified.
Thank you so much, Rosanne. Next, we have Sam Arbesman, who is a scientist in residence at Lux Capital, and he's also the creator of the Overage Catalog, which is a list of new types of research organizations. He wrote two books that I cannot recommend enough. The first is The Half-Life of Facts, and the second one is called Overcomplicated: Technology at the Limits of Comprehension. Sam?
Thank you. So I guess the way I kind of think about it is pretty high level. So the way I think about it is, there's a lot of activities that are valuable for moving science forward, but only a small subset of those things are actually valued by kind of traditional scientific academia. Like there's like the things that get you tenure, but then there's all the other things we could be doing. So the question becomes, how can, and at least in my mind, how can we create new types of organizations that actually begin to actually value those kinds of activities, the broader, larger kind of superset of activities? And when I think about the different types of institutions there are, oftentimes when you think about how to do research, you do it in universities, you do it in corporate industry labs, you might do it in deep tech startups. But the truth is those are just a few points in some weird high dimensional space of the possible types of institutions that there could be. And so for me, I'm actually fairly agnostic as to what the end institutional forms are going to be, but we need to actually have a much larger amount of experimentation there. We need to really be trying lots of new different types of organizations. So for me, the long-term goal is to actually have this nice ecosystem of lots of different types of organizations where people can move between them and really kind of allow people to kind of operate in this sort of over-edge alternate research organizational space. The short-term way to think about this, though, is we also just need more porous boundaries between academia, industry, and these kind of alternative organizations. Because until an alternative organizational ecosystem actually exists, we actually need mechanisms for soft landings for people, or people who are more potentially risk averse. How this can be done, that's still an open question. But the truth is there are certain organizations that are adjacent, actually like adjacent physically to universities, that are kind of set up to make this kind of thing easier. And there's also hints of new types of academic positions for people who might want to move between academia, alternative organizations, or industry, or making a new startup. Ultimately, we need to actually create a more permeable boundary between these new types of organizations, which we just need more of, and more traditional ones to, in my mind, most robustly promote all the different activities that are actually ultimately valuable for scientific progress.
Thank you, Sam. Next, we have Ben Reinhardt, who is a former roboticist historian who is trying to create a private ARPA, so like DARPA, but private. And he's also trying to create new institutional structures to enable more awesome sci-fi shenanigans. Ben?
Yeah, oh, this is great that I get to go right after Sam. So basically, I think my pitch is going to be sort of an extension on Sam's, of like some thoughts around how to achieve that. And then perhaps answer the question, like sort of going back to the question of like, what can existing scientific institutions do? So perhaps one thing to do is just like be more honest about what a institution is good and not good at. So for example, startups are very good at scaling technology. They're very good at selling things that are going to make a profit. They're not necessarily very good at like hardcore research. And similarly, academia is really good at pursuing novel ideas, but not particularly good at scaling them or building systems per se. So one thing that existing institutions can do is really be honest about what their constraints and what their incentives are. And then to Sam's point, make it easy to work with other institutions that have a different set of constraints and incentives. So reducing the bureaucracy behind that, reducing the territory around that. And then, yeah, like also to riff on the soft landing piece, one thing that sort of keeps people from innovating is this, like, these shadows of the future of like, okay, like I kind of eventually want a career. And if that's all you're targeting, then it's going to back propagate to what you do now, and like worrying about like, what do I do? How does what I do now reflect on my career? So if you can give people just kind of this idea that there is something for you if you go out and you try that very innovative, risky thing, can actually go a long way towards enabling that innovation.
Thank you, Ben. Our next speaker is Kelly Mack from the Association of American Colleges and Universities. She's an expert in developing effective leadership to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion goals in STEM fields. She collaborates with the Cardia group on strategies to train and support PIs to ensure that funding aimed at DI efforts is well spent. Kelly?
Thank you, Lana. I'm understanding now why Rosanne wanted to go first. So many great ideas. And so if I could just add just a couple of more to these really excellent topics that have been introduced. What I would like to enter into the space is something that I think we should focus on, has to do with creating a culture where outcomes are not the final goal, right? And I think, Rosanne, you alluded to that, that we begin to create a culture where people feel free to fail and not be completely marginalized from the game of innovation, or just from the enterprise of innovation. I'll say it that way. It's not good to call it a game. So that's one. And then the other one that comes to mind for me that is deeply personal and I think very critical is that as we are moving forward and talking about what industries can do, what organizations can do, that we are mindful about how we use our language, how we are determining where innovation comes from. And in the US, words like innovation, words like risk are often coded terms for things that should be avoided, or things that only come from certain individuals and not from diverse populations. And I think it's important that when we are defining this space, that we are very clear about what is meant by excellence, what's meant by innovation, and what's meant by risk, particularly when we know scientists are coming with certain biases about what those words mean. And I also think it's important that we focus on, give attention to who gets to decide what innovation is and who gets to decide what risk is, because that has a lot to do with how those terms get perceived. So for me, this work is about certainly seeing some significant gains in terms of innovation, but it's also about ensuring that as we go along, things like innovation are fully inclusive of the entire spectrum of everybody in the STEM enterprise. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. So next we have Diana Cardia from the Cardia Group. She's an expert in organizational change and leadership development in academia, devoted to solving the most vexing and important challenges facing faculty, staff, and administrators today. Diana?
Great, thank you, Lana. My vote is that we do more to recognize that science is produced by humans. I spend just about every day looking at, talking to, engaging with people where science is blocked and humanity is squandered. And it's because we think that science is produced by brains and we interact with each other as if that's what we should be, a collection of brains talking to each other. And there are huge losses in who creates science as a result and what counts as science as a result. So if I am just a brain and science is just the domain of an active brain, then I need a wife to take care of my life. I need public servants to clean up after me, and I need less well-paid people to do all the things that are underneath me. That does not produce the science that we need. It also means that we have unrealistic expectations. We don't accommodate, whether it's parenting or elder care or, in my family, a friend of the family just had a heart attack yesterday. But science goes on as if none of that should be happening and as if we are weak if we stop to account for that. That does not produce the science we need right now. What also happens, I think, is that theory gets elevated over practice when we think of ourselves just as brains and humans are something. That's where it gets applied, and it's somehow less than all the elevated thinking that we want to do. And finally, when we are only these conscious brains, we don't take into account our unconscious mind and all the effects it has on us through implicit bias, things like that. And I've seen far too many places where it just becomes a competition. We lose curiosity, we lose the ability to truly collaborate. And all of that comes from our humanity. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So next will be Olaf. So Olaf co-founded ventures in science and tech on 3 continents. He now directs the Cross Labs, which is a lab between industry and academia. And he's also the vice president of the board of the International Society for Artificial Life. Olaf?
Thanks, Lena. Yeah, so many nice pitches. It's hard to go later. Yeah, I just have 3 points. So I think science is doing a great job, right? We write papers, get peer assessments and self-improving feedback loops, all of that, great. In practice, having seen different institutions from the outside or the inside, the machinery is very old, actually hundreds of years old, and rusty, and suffers from, I think, 3 issues. It's one is unwanted, I think, competition, individuality, and this connects nicely with what Kelly just said. Yeah, even with the best intentions of collaborations, working well together in an organization and doing social good even, it's a wrestling arena. Lots of competitions for the largest grants, first authorship that would lead you to publish those fancy papers that lead to those grants, and until you get tenured and don't care, it's hard to address that without a structural change. I think second would come the biggest fish for me out there. It's the reward system, and largely the publication system. So not merely talking about the peer review per se, that is suffering from biases and more issues, but mostly the larger issue of the whole ecosystem of researchers enslaved by the academic journal system, which is just globally accepted, embraced by all research institutes we know, and we have to. It's very problematic, I think, in particular for in the very promising intersections between research fields where trans interdisciplinarity typically comes at the cost of being less or not at all acknowledged by the recognized canonical areas of science. And it's the same for tech too. If it doesn't have, like we just said earlier with Kelly and Rosanne, doesn't have an immediate short-term application, then you're done, right? So yeah, the third point would be, so my last one, I promise, the new landscape, I think, of the model of the university, which is changing. So with MOOCs, online solutions, now replacing traditional kind of learning and research, we are evolving rapidly towards something very different, arguably even faster with COVID. Academia may need to co-evolve more, I think, with the industry and society. Most importantly, with this new society that is in its information age. So the system is an ancestral monastery-based one, and I think we have to evolve it towards something a bit new and rethink research organizations to address these 3 points, I think. Competition, the reward system, and this new landscape. And I think we need to deconstruct, rebuild. So I'm really glad to chat with you today.
Thank you, Olaf. And so I'm last. So I'm Lana Sinapayen. I'm a researcher at Sony Computer Science Labs in Kyoto. I'm an advocate for open science. And I also work for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the International Society for Artificial Life. I think everyone made very good points. So there is maybe not much left to add, but I'm building this open science platform called Mimosa. And one of the biggest issues that I face with open science and with science organizations in general is the issue of incentives and what kind of metrics we choose to judge people when we hire them, when we promote them, when we give them grants. Ideally, we want to hire and promote people who do good science. But I don't think the metrics that we use actually reflect that. We tend to penalize people who collaborate a lot, for example, and are not the first author on papers. We penalize people who do slow science that takes a lot of time and then maybe just produces one paper. We penalize people who have a path that is not perfectly linear, or people who went maybe into many different fields, or on the opposite side, people who are too specialized on one topic. But on the other hand, if I show you a pool of candidates and ask, who would you like to collaborate with as an equal? That's not really the kind of thing that we will judge. We want somebody who is a good collaborator, who is used to collaborations. We want maybe somebody who has a lot of knowledge about different fields, somebody who is an interesting, good person who does good science, even if the science is not showy. You want to be sure that the person will not, for example, just make up data and then you end up with a lot of retracted papers, this kind of thing. So I'm very concerned with the incentive structure. Maybe metrics are antithetical to good science, maybe not. So I would like to know a bit everyone's ideas about this issue. So Olaf, back to you. So Olaf will be moderating today.
Yeah, and my job should be easy. There are so many threads right now, and this second phase is together with our audience as well. Please feel free to comment on YouTube. So I'll be checking on the comments and questions. And yeah, we should be able to should feel free to address each other's points in a very free way. So I really hear.
Am I able to jump in or?
Oh, sure.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say it's related to the idea of the metrics. And I think it's a really tough question because like anytime you create a new metric, then people just start gaming it. I think ultimately the question becomes like, how can we have like a broader suite of metrics to allow people to actually say, okay, basically to allow people to choose and say, these are the things I value and these are the things I care about. And so one of the ways I think about this, and Ben and I have actually discussed this paper, it came out maybe 5-10 years ago or so. It was someone studied the immunology literature, and he was looking at, I think, like the past 50 years of the immunology literature, and he looked at people who were highly cited as well as people who were like mediocrely cited, but actually were highly acknowledged at the end of papers. So they were listed in the acknowledgements of many papers. And it turns out these people who had a mediocre number of citations, when they died, the productivity of all their collaborators actually dropped. So it shows these people were actually very valuable, but we weren't necessarily measuring them. Now, one solution would just be, let's start counting acknowledgements. That can obviously be easily gamed. But at the same time, though, it shows that there are clearly more ways of measuring that we just need to be thinking about. And so ideally, when you're going to a tenure committee or whatever it is, you should say, okay, here are a number of different metrics that I think actually show that I'm contributing to science. And going back to like my earlier point of, okay, there's a lot of things that are valuable for science. Right now, we count citations and certain publications and things like that, as opposed to saying, helping people, or actually the ability to do a really long-term project, like what Lana mentioned earlier, which I know oftentimes we think, universities can do really long-term research, but at the same time, it happens on the lifespan of a grant cycle. You're not doing research for like a 20-year project or whatever. So we just need to find more of these ways. And so this is kind of a long way of saying, I think there are metrics to do this, but it's going to be a really tough uphill battle because you want to make sure they're not gamed. And you also want to make sure that people begin to realize, oh, wait, there are all these other ways of measuring things that we could be caring about.
Can I riff on that and say something that's perhaps slightly heretical in the 21st century, which is that perhaps we should use less metrics and go more on trust. So if the sort of anecdotes that I love are from Bell Labs, where people would be working on very long-term projects, and I think this gets also to I forget, was it Diana who was talking about the ability to fail more? It's like that's what trust allows you to do. Where it's like if you have someone who is sort of like determining your paycheck, and they're doing that not based on like a suite of metrics that they have to just justify to some faceless group of people, but instead you're like, hey, look, I'm working on this thing. Does this make sense to you? And they're like, yes. And you're like, okay, cool. I'm going to do this for Kelly was the one who talked about room to fail. And so if you're working on something and there's this trust relationship, then and it doesn't work out, then they sort of knew all along that you were working on something that was promising, even though it didn't cash out in some set of metrics. And it's like frankly, I think like trust is one of the hardest things to game over a long period of time with repeat interactions. So the heretical opinion is less metrics.
Lana?
The point about trust so much connects to the importance of relationship too. Because right now what happens in the funding cycle is the decision gets made, can we invest? Can we take this risk? And then the money is given and the relationship's over. And so then people, like, the trust is based on, we've given you the money and you'll do something, rather than an ongoing relationship that allows both support and witnessing and a kind of ongoing collaboration about if things are working or not working. What does it mean? What does it mean for that researcher? What does it mean for other related research? So I see that point about trust really living inside stronger ongoing relationships between all the pieces in the cycle that's producing research.
Yeah, so I hear right metrics, more trust rather than metrics, cultivating longer term relationships. Lana, what's your
I think
take?
Kelly will maybe we have something to say about this, but I just wanted to say a word from my experience is that you trust people you know, and when you're trying to hire people, you don't know who they are, and so trust becomes very close to bias. But maybe Kelly has something to say, I think.
So thanks, Lana. I just wanted to kind of enter into this conversation another perspective, because we've been talking about scientific organizations and trust within that. But I think this goes beyond our scientific organizations, and I'm thinking about the funding process just in general. So in the US, it is our government that funds our federal funding agencies. And the pressure on program officers who have to make these funding decisions, the pressure by Congress for there to be some specific outcomes for this investment that Congress is making, then means that a program officer can't afford the luxury of trusting that you will produce something that can't be measured, because then there's nothing that can be reported back to Congress. Without those kinds of outcomes, then that funding stream dries up or goes away. So I just wanted to kind of bring into this conversation that these kinds of issues that we are talking about do extend beyond scientific organizations themselves.
I think, Rosanne, you also wanted to react to that.
Yeah, so hearing all these amazing discussions, I think, like, as a researcher, I sort of want to, like, group all those topics into bento boxes so I can better organize it in my head. So it sounds like we started with how to incentivize people, and that's talking about the relationship between an organization and its members or employees, like these people. And then we talk about metrics, because sometimes people look at metrics to figure out how to grow, and that's the incentivized part. And we talk about we need lots of metrics, and Ben's point of we don't need any metrics, we need trust, but trust also is kind of a kind of metric. But then we talk about this funding and organizations relationship, which are built on trust. I fully agree, but we sort of got away from this organization to people relationship to organization to funding relationship. Do you guys agree?
Can I
Sure.
respond to that and respond to Kelly real quick?
Sure.
So one is I don't think you can box those things so cleanly, because at the end of the day, a organization's relationship with its people is contingent on that organization continuing to survive, and that organization continuing to survive has to do with its funding source. So I would argue that it's unfortunately this, like, very mushy coupled system. So it's like, I mean, that is a reasonable taxonomy, but I think that they're like strongly coupled. Does that make sense?
Well, for sure, but it's still different metrics. So are we talking about the metric of an organization for its survival or growth? Or are we talking about a metric that the organization imposed to its people for them to thrive, which of course is linked to the organization itself's growth?
Right. So yeah, so it's like, I mean, like, it just gets passed on, right? So you have some funder and they're like, I want to see your organization do this number of things. And then the organization in turn turns around. Like, organizations are made out of people. And so those people then are behoove into those metrics as well.
Yeah, for sure. I'm just saying there are different sets of definitions. They're all metrics, but yeah, agree.
Yeah. And then just I wanted to respond to Kelly quickly. You're absolutely right, and this is why I would argue that there's a fundamental tension in the government funding research, in the sense that on the one hand, governments are accountable to taxpayers, and so they kind of do need to show like what you're getting for your money effectively, and at the same time, research involves like being irresponsible sometimes. And so that's why I think that this sort of paradigm that we've gotten into in the second half of the 20th century, where we expect government to fund the majority of research, I think does have that tension. And so something that I just want to, like, I always like to flag is the fact that yes, a lot of research creates public goods, but governments are not the only way to provide public goods. So yes, like strong agreement there, Kelly.
Yeah, I would like to also include a question that we have from YouTube about peer review, and Brian Chung asks, does anyone think it's weird that reviews and evaluation in research is evaluated by peers and not by users, which is an exciting question to me. And I think we mentioned some of that. So yeah, does anyone want to address that?
Diana, I think.
Diana, yeah.
So I want to start by saying I don't think it's weird. Brian went on to say that's like Yelp reviews of a restaurant being written by owners and employees. I actually think it's more like Michelin stars being given by other highly educated chefs who really understand what needs to be accomplished and what it takes to accomplish that. So that aspect of the peer review process, I deeply appreciate and am glad exists. I do think, though, that where I see the missing feedback is this connection from theory to practice. Kelly and I have done some work, for example, with the geosciences. And one of the projects we worked on was really looking at how people who are looking at the impact of climate change in cities, the scientists, spend more time with the lived people who are suffering from the effects of what's happening on because of climate change in cities. Like that connection, that is your science helping me? Is it helping me fast enough? Does your science understand my experience? That piece I would like to see much, much more of.
Yeah, it's a very important point. Does anyone else want to respond to that question?
Maybe I have a point that can link the comment and what Diana says, which is I do think there is good and bad peer review. And when we say peer review, the assumption is, well, because you are my peer, you are good at reviewing me because you're kind of my equal. But good peer reviews are hard to write, and we don't really learn how to make a good peer review. So I wouldn't be against having a way to say, some people make good peer reviews and they should be maybe the one doing the review, rather than anyone who is, who wants, if you want to do a peer review, it's fine. Everyone should be able to peer review anyone's work, but not all peer reviews are necessarily good. Not all peer reviews are necessarily from people who can write good reviews.
And yeah, I think that's very true. Also, I want to acknowledge the fact that, like Rosanne said earlier, this is another metric, and maybe a dangerous one, because we have a lot of it in a way, because anything that hits an outcome out there, a direct application, would be highly, maybe implicitly reviewed by masses and maybe by the press. So I think it's a point that is present in there already, even if it is a bit implicit in a subtle way. I think Rosanne and then Diana.
Diana was first.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you, Rosanne. I just want to tie this back to the point I started with. I totally agree with you, Lana. that peer review can be done very badly. And it has a lot to do with when people are doing peer review from the perspective of, I have an idea, and is my mental analysis the only thing that's useful? When in fact, peer review is often a development process, it's often a mentoring process, it's often an HR process, and yet academics, at least, are seldom developed or trained or encouraged to think about it in any of those ways.
So I love the analogy that Brian brought up about Yelp reviews. So I tend to think about like movie reviews. So we have movie reviews from users or watchers. That's the IMDb. But we also have movie reviewed by professionals. That's like the Oscars and Golden Globes. So they both exist. Why can't we have the same thing both exist in science? But then the thing is like, which one's more prevalent? So in the movie space, seems like IMDb is more prevalent. At least maybe I'm the watcher and not the expert. But also Oscar is also as prestigious, like all the actors and movie makers are trying to excel in that arena. So can we have both arenas as well? And they each can be prevalent in their own way and have a good reputation in their own way.
So what Rosanne just said made me change my mind. I think rather than good and bad reviews, maybe what matters is whether the reviewer has the same kind of values, things that they value as I do. Because when I read movie reviews, if somebody I don't like, an anonymous user says, I like this movie because, you know, it was very sad and I like sad movies, for example, that maybe if I like sad movies, that review is more important to me than the review of an expert that says, you know, this movie is a copy of another movie or something.
Can I say something to peer review and actually tie it back to metrics? I would assert that the whole problem with peer review is not the peer review itself, but what it's now coupled to, right? So peer review is like how you get tenure, how you get grants, and a whole host of other things, are, as opposed to like just, are you doing good work? Let's like work with your, like the other people in your field to advance the state of knowledge in the field. It's no longer that, right? Like there's so many other things that hinge on peer review that it has become this like entire other game besides assessing the quality of the work. And I think like that's the thing that is not working right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a question from YouTube, from Vikram. Why is peer review process so obfuscated? Why isn't it same as doing a PR review on an open source project where everyone can contribute, from the experts to the end users? I think that's important. I want to also connect the point of the subjective part that Diana has presented early on, connected with trust. And so everything is human, right? Like the HR process, the scientists, the scholars are people, and yes, the reviews might be, and someone is saying that on YouTube as well, are subjective to an extent. How to bring that back to an objective? Maybe we cannot. Yeah, how do we feel about that? And I don't know who is first now. Is it you, Kelly? Yeah, either way.
I thought, okay, Diane is pointing at me to go first. So many things. I just wanted to put in this quick thing. Diana, you mentioned that reviews are a lot of things like mentoring, and people do them for different reasons. I totally agree with that. And I wanted to add to that conversation how reviewers are incentivized. And I think that also contributes to how one shows up to do a review. If I am not appropriately incentivized, I do it in my spare time. I do it when I can. And if I get to it, I get to it. And if I get to it well, then I get to it well. And if I don't, I don't. As opposed to other countries that I'm aware of that go way beyond the US in terms of incentivizing their reviewers, and reviewers then show up in that space in a very different frame of mind, having brought the very best of what they can to that review process and in actually writing the review as well. So I wanted to just add that to your list, Diana.
Lena, do you have a quick answer to that before we go to Diana?
No, Diana was first.
Yeah, okay, Diana.
I want to just tie this together because I see in the chat this, in my mind, overvaluing of objectivity. To say that things are subjective and to say that there's context never means that the objective reality, 2 + 2 may be 4 in a context, but you need to know the reality that you're operating in. Because if you are not applying an objective truth to a reality that it applies to, you've lost objectivity, but you never know because you're elevating objectivity over context, over subjectivity. So we need the subjectivity in order to reinforce the objectivity. So I don't think that science is objective. I don't think it should be aiming to be objective. I think it should be aiming to protect the objectivity by true engagement with the subjectivity, and all objectivity and subjectivity are in relationship to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Lena?
Yeah, I wanted to react to the comment that said that peer review is kind of this dark process. And that's true, but there are some initiatives to make it more open, where you publish a paper and then the reviews are published with the paper. So in that way, you know why the reviewers said what they said. And also the reviewers get some credit for reviewing this paper if the review was very good, or if it was just very useful.
Yeah, I think this is a very, very difficult point, almost philosophical, not almost, philosophical, definitely. And to add a bit of controversy, I think it is very difficult for science to be objective. Maybe, in my view, it's not at all. It is intersubjective rather than being objective. And even with the methods that may be mathematical and so on, we have to acknowledge that we are humans, we have biases, and we are the ones reviewing for now science. And the for now part makes me think of a question I had earlier, connecting with some of the things that have been said. Are we moving towards a full algorithms of science, as in maybe AI algorithm or AI assisted at least? Is that scary, or is that the only future way that we'll be facing soon? Sam?
Sure. Yeah, and the way I think about it is, and humans are a tool-using species, and we used microscopes to see things that we couldn't see with the naked eye. We used telescopes to see things we couldn't see, like far off in space. And AI is another kind of tool, whether or not it allows us to kind of connect various papers together in certain ways, in kind of unexpected ways, create and help us develop like hypotheses that are worth testing, actually help figure out the specific experiments that are worth running. I kind of view it as like ideally there should be like a nice kind of like glorious human machine partnership in how we think about like discovering new things and actually the scientific process. I certainly understand how for some people that can be a little worrying of like, okay, like we're kind of, and we think we're rational creatures or whatever, or at least somewhat rational. How are we going to be doing things that we can maybe not fully understand, or we're kind of outsourcing some of this to machines? And there's this Yiddish term nachas, which is kind of like it's like vicarious pride or joy in like your kids' accomplishments. Like when they, I don't know, do graduate college or whatever, like you can like shep nachas or have nachas. Like they're not your own accomplishments, but you can have pride. And I feel like you can kind of do the same thing with like our AI discoveries or scientific progress. Like we can have nachas for them. Like it's okay. And like we don't have to feel that suddenly we're being like relegated to this thing. But even aside from that, I do think there is a sense that these are tools, and science has always been at the vanguard of accepting and trying tools to actually make discoveries. And I think that's, yeah, so I don't think it should be something like worried about or causing anxiety can actually be something we should be embracing.
Rosanne?
Just offering an alternative opinion. So I love the analogy of AI being tools, but I think one thing that's preventing it being a useful tool is that we don't understand it. That is our state of AI. I work in this field, so I know we don't understand why things work. We don't understand why things don't work. So that's the one thing that's different from tools, because the actual tools that we understand, we design them. So we fully know that they should function in a responsible and constrained way. And the other analogy that I love that Sam, you made is an AI as a child, that we can be proud of them. Great. And I love the child part of it. But the concerning part is that it might not be a child. It is definitely newborn, is lived shorter than the human race, but it might be more powerful than you think a child might be. So that's just the two concerning parts.
Yeah, and I see reactions to these remarks on YouTube also about what we should do next. So Christian says, you have talked about the better ways to do and evaluate science peer review, right? But what would be the process we need to follow to get there? And who's responsible for making those changes? And I would add, what is steering that in terms of organizational structural change? And I think that's why we're here too. Yeah.
So that's the hardest question, right? Because change is hard. It's happening very slowly, but even in very small things, like who writes peer review? You know, who gets chosen as a reviewer? It's completely archaic. Most of the time, it's just somebody asked me, do you have friends in this field? Please give me their names. Oh, they will be reviewers. That's how we do it currently. We know it's not good. We know there are much better ways, and yet it's not changing very fast. You know, it could change very fast. It's easy to change, but it's not. And I think it ties back to the issue of incentives. You know, there are no incentives. There are no strong incentives to change things when the people who could make the change, who have the power to make the change, already have the power.
So to talk, so one is, it depends on who we is, right? Depending on who we're talking about, there are many different things that people can do. So one place that it has been demonstrated that this change can come from is the funders, and this ties back to this cascading metrics thing. So you started to see organizations like the Gates Foundation have these mandates about open science. And that really does affect things, right? Because if people are like, oh, well, I have to do this in order to get money, they'll start doing the thing. So that's how, one of the sort of most independent variables is funders. And then the funders, the government, put pressure on your congressperson, write your representative, whoever that might be. Another thing, I believe James Heathers is advocating a program where people where you just refuse to do peer review for free, right? And that can completely change the game. So it's the problem with these systemic changes is that there's no single intervention point, but it's you sort of push back wherever you can, and there are people sort of doing that at sort of every place in the system.
Yeah, I think we might have some examples in the room, and maybe, either Diana, maybe do you want to go first?
Sure. Kelly and I have been working on two different interventions that I think speak to some of what we're talking about. One that we're working on is it's in the peer review process, and we are taking large numbers of, in this case, engineers, taking them through a 6-month process of exposing them to the social science literature on group dynamics, cognitive bias, social identities, and conflict. It's a lot of information, but it is specifically motivated by a desire to fund more innovative research. So the motivation is intrinsic. It's not a kind of training. You have to go to the implicit bias training. It's intrinsic motivation. It's building on smart people taking a download of a lot of information and applying it to a process that they care about with enough support that that application happens over time. So that's one example.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we might have other examples in the room, but yeah, it's very important, I think, to work with very practical cases in mind to see what has worked, what hasn't, so that we can use them as small models to make the next step.
Yeah, I would
Kelly?
like to. Oh, sorry. Somebody, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Lana.
I wanted to ask Diana, who funds these initiatives, and also, how do you motivate them to actually do that?
Well, in this case, it's funded by the National Science Foundation. And so the motivation comes because the funder itself is saying, we recognize that the results that we are mandated by the government are more likely to occur if we all pull together to have this knowledge and put it into practice. So the funder, it trickles down from the funder, but most of our people come from academia, and what they are reporting to us is that the things we are addressing, they can apply in so many different aspects of their life, faculty meetings, research meetings, that becomes its own motivation.
Yeah, Kelly?
Sure. So I was just going to talk about the other project that Diana and I work on together, because it actually goes back to where we met. And it was an effort by program officers at the National Science Foundation. This time it was in the geosciences. And it was their desire to foster innovative projects around broadening participation in the geosciences. And they hosted an ideas lab. And the ideas lab brought together a cohort of geoscientists and social scientists and people from a wide range of other disciplines as well, who all went through this really rigorous ideation process that lasted a week long. And Diana and I were there to support them. I think what's interesting, though, is that what came out of all of that messiness every week as they were ideating were some really innovative projects that are still ongoing. But the part that I think is relevant to our discussion here is that this idea, this effort originated with the program officers themselves. And so I think we just can't emphasize enough when we're talking about risk-taking, when we're talking about peer review, the role of the program officer and how they are able to, or not able to in some cases, set the tone for what is going to be an acceptable level of tolerance for risk during that entire peer review process.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. Yeah, I think there are many of those examples that we could really profit from learning from. We will be going into private discussion part soon. I want to thank again everyone for joining today, and including the audience on YouTube asking very relevant questions. This is a very important topic to me and to Lana and everyone here. So we will be organizing something next. It could be another workshop, it could be something more practical, and it could be a white paper. If you are interested in joining, please please feel free to fill in the form that we posted in the comments and also in the description below this video on YouTube. And yeah, we look forward to any kind of comment. Please contact us. Yeah, we'd be thrilled to continue this project together with more members too, and learn from everyone. Yeah, thank you so much, and yeah, see you soon.